section at the PUC. We're very happy to have you here with us. We're looking forward to digging into this content for the next 2.5 hours or so with you. We hope that all of you have had the chance to read the ruling and its attachment by now. But before we dig in, I do want to have the chance to introduce 3 commissioners we have here with us who I assume you'll tell the truth to if they ask you if you've read the paper by now or not, who might want to say a couple words of intro. So I'll pass it off to Commissioner Rechtschaffen first.
Well, there'll be a quiz, Nathan, so we'll be able to know if they read the paper. And that's the first 15 minutes of the program. Thank you, Nathan. Thanks for joining us. Today, I'm the assigned commissioner for the IRP. We look forward to a very productive conversation. My hope is that the type of procurement program that's described in the staff paper that you have can help us create market certainty, more market certainty, and replace what we've had currently with procurement orders every couple of years, maybe a little bit of an ad hoc way with a more predictable, smooth procurement process. We, of course, want this procurement program to meet all the goals of the IRP program: reliability, affordability, and helping us meet our GHG goals. And the staff has put together staff has spent a lot of time putting together this proposal with various options. Many of them have pros and cons, as you see in the paper. We're looking forward to your questions and your feedback in written comments. I will have to leave about 30 minutes early, but I look forward to the first 2 hours of today's discussion. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Shiroma?
Thank you. I also want to say thank you to the Energy Division team. This is a very important effort, important workshop. I mean, we are just on the heels of the heat storm and the efforts that have been made so far on the integrated resource plan, on the resource adequacy, on demand response. These things are all key parts of resiliency and the future. So I look forward to hearing the presentations and discussions, learning some more. And I also will need to depart at about 4 o'clock, but very much appreciate the time and effort that has been placed in this very important journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner John Reynolds?
Thank you, Nathan, and I will echo the thanks to the IRP team for developing this options paper as well as hosting this workshop. I too will look forward to the discussion that we hear today and hearing from different perspectives about the options paper. I will have to drop off briefly at about 3 o'clock, but I will be back after and really look forward to learning more today.
Thanks, and I see our Bagley Keene partner on the IRP proceeding, President Alice Reynolds, has also joined us. President Reynolds, any remarks?
Thank you, Nathan. I really don't have anything to add to Commissioner Rechtschaffen's opening comments. Were very well stated, and I just wanted to welcome everyone here today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I also won't be able to stay the whole time, but I look forward to joining as much as I can. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So if we could screen share and just skip to the second slide, I want to go over a little bit of logistics and scope before we start really digging in. The slides that we're going to be going through for the next couple hours are all posted to the IRP Procurement Track webpage. Please ping us if it's unclear how to get there. The workshop is being recorded, as you guys heard a couple minutes ago. And there's 2 main objectives here. The first is to familiarize all of you, IRP stakeholders, with the contents of the staff options paper from the September 8th ruling. The second is to provide opportunities for you to ask clarifying questions and to really assist and help in development of the comments that are due on the paper in November. Out of scope is actually questions on the other part of that ruling, which were potential near-term options for procurement issues. We know that, especially given the reliability issues we had a couple weeks back during the heat event, that might be a topic that's rich in interest, and folks might be chomping at the bit to have some stakeholder level discussion about it. But comments for that part of the ruling are due next week, and it's out of scope for this webinar. The next slide, we have a little bit of housekeeping, mainly about how we're going to be doing Q&A interactions for the next couple hours here. So most of you are probably used to IRP webinars being different mixes of verbal versus written Q&A and interaction between staff and stakeholders. This content for this webinar is significant, but it's a little bit different than the content that you've probably gotten used to, and especially some of our modeling advisory group webinars, which tends to be more technical. What we're doing here is a little bit more given to conversation. So what we're going to be doing logistically is leaning a little bit more towards verbal interaction where possible. So what that means is we will be asking you, if you have a question, to raise your hand through the WebEx raise hand function. For those that are just calling in, you can dial *3 to raise your hand. If those two options don't work, you can then look in the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx screen to see what should look like 3 black dots, where a Q&A function is an option underneath that menu, and we'll be able to get to your question. We'll try to deal with questions at regular intervals. Before you ask your question, we ask please ID yourself and your organization. I'll also provide my usual caveat to please try to keep the things that you raise your hand about and speak about to clarifying questions. We understand there's can be desire to make assertions, to assert party positions, et cetera, on certain things. We're going to ask you to try to keep that to a minimum. As a courtesy to all the other stakeholders on the phone, this is really a time for everyone to get a better understanding of the issues that we're presenting. And should you have any questions that don't get addressed today, please use the IRP data request email at the bottom of this slide that most of you are probably familiar with by now. The next slide, we have a pretty packed agenda. So we're almost through with the introduction, almost on time. We'll then be hearing from various colleagues across kind of the IRP sphere, but not just the IRP team. So I've already introduced myself, Nathan Barsick, Neil Raffin, Lauren Reiser, and James McGarry, all analysts on the IRP team, will be presenting over the course of this afternoon. We'll also be hearing from Dina Mackin, supervisor of the retail choice section. And we have on the panel with us Jamie Rose Gannon, senior analyst with the resource adequacy team, Christian Neeram, analyst with the RPS team, and Aaron Burdick, a colleague from E3 Consulting, who has helped in the development of this paper. Without further ado, I think we can move on to the meat of today's program. I think I can pass it over to Neil Raffin for that.
Thanks, Nathan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you now. And yeah, I'm an analyst on the IRP team. Basically, we're going to walk through the paper pretty much in the order it's written, generally highlighting content from the paper, but also throwing in a few examples to aid understanding. So firstly, on background, and look, this room of people, I'm sure, knows this very well. So just to try and summarize what the paper lays out is, firstly, on this, the first slide here, we've got a snapshot of how the CPUC currently regulates planning and procurement. And so we've got the RA program, resource adequacy, which requires contracting for system reliability, local reliability, flexibility, those needs all in the near term, and ensures that that capacity has a must-offer obligation into the CAISO market. Then we have the IRP process, and more on that shortly. We've got RPS program, which requires load-serving entities, LSEs, to procure a minimum portion of their load from renewable sources. And we have various demand-side proceedings that require planning and procurement of demand-side resources. Paper highlights 3 main trends evident over the last few years. So we've got the increased role of the community choice aggregators, CCAs. We've got increasing capacity market tightness, not just in the CAISO, but across the West. And we've got ambitious GHG reduction goals here in California and also in our neighboring states. So a bit more about why we're talking about a programmatic approach now. So on to the next slide. In IRP, we've had two instances of procurement action in the proceeding today. We've had the D19-1116 decision for 3,300 megawatts of net qualifying capacity, new resources, and then D21-06035, the midterm reliability order, also for new resources amounting to 11.5 gigawatts of net qualifying capacity. So in the terminology of the paper, these are procurement orders. And as the paper says, there are concerns with this order-by-order approach. And they're somewhat unpredictable for LSEs. Regarding load migration, allocation of a procurement need is relatively static from the point in time of the order. For example, load migration from a non-IOU to an IOU after the order does not change who has to procure. And each order is relatively bespoke, so it's somewhat uncertain for LSEs what might be ordered next. And then the other point here is that the focus on new resources does not expressly address the challenge of how to retain the optimal existing resources that we need into the future. Mention of the November 2020 staff proposal here, and it goes deeper into the background I just laid out there. And just as a comparison to this paper to help provide context, that 2020 document is broader in that it tackles the question of how all IRP planning findings should lead to actual procurement. Whereas this paper we're talking about today is focused on the subset of that which it's appropriate to do programmatically. And then finally, regarding the why now are we tackling these challenges, the most recent decision in the IRP proceeding was in February, and it committed to developing a programmatic approach to achieve the IRP's goals of reliability, GHG reduction, and least cost procurement. And so the first step staff have taken in drafting the paper, and you can see it now in section 3, are the program objectives, which we've put in short form on the next slide. These will be really important very soon for assessing the options available for program design. So it's key that we as a planning and procurement community can level set on what these objectives mean and the priorities of them. So I'm going to call out a handful of the 14 in here. Number one, very broad and central, and it encompasses the reliability and the GHG reduction that the program must help achieve. Number 2 brings in the consideration of cost. Objective number 10 gets at scope, and so the paper explains more thinking of this in section 3. But in brief, we suggest that the program scope not include driving resource-specific procurement, for example, large-scale or long lead time resources. To do so would make need determination and also cost allocation very complicated. And it would probably result in taking us back to an order-by-order approach. So that's laid out in section 3. And then related to this is objective number 12 there regarding retail choice. And I just want to emphasize up front that the staff's approach in writing the paper is that each LLC must self-provide. So respecting the individual LLC's autonomy. So I've only mentioned a few of the objectives there, and please ask questions you may have about the 14. And finally, not an objective per se, but the paper states that the program be feasible to adopt soon and feasible to maintain thereafter from a staff workload perspective, as well as load serving entities and the industry more broadly. Now I'll just hand to Lauren Reiser on my team to set the scene for designing a procurement program.
All right, thanks, Neil. You can move to the next slide. All right, so Neil just discussed kind of the program objectives as well as why we're developing a program. This slide is kind of about kind of what we mean when we say we are developing a program. The first question being, what do we mean when we say programmatic? We see that as meaning moving away from the order-by-order procurement action that we've been describing and setting rolling, ongoing requirements that industry could meet. And so what does that look like? We have here that it would look like a set of rules and incentives. I think you could think of that kind of like a standard playbook to follow as we for this program to function. And so we see that as having these 4 fundamental design elements of a program that are listed here. Obviously, there are a lot of questions that we need to answer in order to have a functional program, but we see these as kind of creating the core structure of what it would mean for the program to operate. And so I'm just going to quickly orient you to each of these options. I think they're familiar to a lot of the people in the room right now because we answered these questions as we were doing the 2 orders we have in the IRP program. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to them, and they will be discussed as well as the options we have for each of these in more detail later in the presentations. And so starting with need determination, this is kind of the first stage. It's how we consider our analysis of what resources are needed. And so that would be what resources do we need for reliability, as well as what resources do we need for our GHG reduction goals, as well as another key component of this is when are the resources needed by. So a need determination would give us both the quantity of resources or resource attributes needed and the timing of the need for those attributes. The next stage would be the need allocation. How do we allocate this need across LSCs? What is a fair way to allocate the need that we found among the LSCs that operate? And so since, as Neil stated, we are assuming self-provision that each LSC will procure its own need, this need allocation step would directly flow to what are the requirements in terms of quantity of need and timing of need that we place on each LSC. The next core element is compliance. And I kind of see like 2 separate buckets within compliance. The first being what are the compliance rules that LSCs will follow in this program. This might refer to the resource counting rules that we'll talk about a bit, what kind of ELCCs are used, as well as other requirements that the program might create, such as contract length requirements, those types of compliance requirements, as well as the kind of the second part of this being how do we monitor LSC's compliance with these rules that we have set. And so this monitoring would likely be similar to the compliance and monitoring that we have set so far in our current IRP orders, but we of course are considering and open to process improvements as well as considering new compliance approaches and interested to hearing from stakeholders there. And finally, the last key element we see is enforcement. This is how we respond when we find in the previous stage that an LC may not be in compliance with the requirements. In terms of enforcement, we currently have 2 different enforcement mechanisms in IRP from our first 2 orders. We have backstop procurement, which is if an LSC is found to be deficient, then the CPUC could order the IOU, who is the service territory the LSC is in, to procure those resources on their behalf. And then the costs of that just-in-time procurement would be allocated to that deficient LSC. As well as we also have penalties stemming from the midterm reliability procurement that could additionally be assessed. And so in designing this program, We'll need to consider enforcement mechanisms such as those, as well as other options such as, a different way of assessing penalties as one example. And so those are what we see as the key elements. Just some kind of other fundamental high-level things to mention is this program must also be designed to address what we see as the key market failures that are leading to the need for, the orders we've had thus far and the need to order procurement in the future. And so those, I think, I'm not going to review in detail because they flow into the program objectives that are listed. But some of the key market failures, that we see that the program must address are the need to maintain system reliability, the greenhouse gas externality of operating the electricity system, financial risk, including risk of LSC failure, as well as risks of market power. And so the last thing that I'm going to mention here is just that something we see as fundamental is that this be one program. We've mentioned both reliability and greenhouse gas reduction needs as goals so far. And while there certainly will need to be fundamental differences in how we approach some of these elements for reliability versus our greenhouse gas or clean energy needs. For example, there might need to be a different need determination because they use different metrics. While there certainly be differences, we do think it's important that this be one program that can achieve, both of those objectives in terms of our needs, and importantly be complied with by the LSCs with one key compliance filing. And so that's just a quick orientation into what the key elements that will be discussed in more detail are. And so now I think I can hand it to Neil to discuss reliability in more depth.
Thanks, Lauren. And actually, just opening us more generally, we'd envisaged a break for questions here. So we do have time for questions on the content we've just covered so far.
So a reminder to folks to either use the raise hand function, *3 on their phone, or to use the Q&A box in the lower right for their questions. Looks like we have one for Julia Levin. Julia, you should be unmuted.
Levin with the Bioenergy Association of California, and thank you for holding this workshop. I was surprised on slide 6 when you talked about recent trends that have changed market fundamentals that you didn't actually mention climate change impacts, because it seems like, the increase in wildfires and the drop in hydropower supplies due to a multi-year or multi-decade drought are huge factors affecting reliability. So I'm just curious why climate change impacts and climate change adaptation wasn't included in that list. It seems like a very significant omission.
Julia, it's a good point. Part of, I think, your response is kind of buried in just elephant in the room type stuff. And if what we have in that slide amounts to an omission, it might be that, such a big part of what we're doing is towards climate policy that perhaps, explicit mention in that detailed list just didn't happen. But I think that there might be a second part of your question there about what about adaptability and other things like that. Would you mind developing on that?
Well, what is mentioned is the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but that's a very different issue than what's already happening with climate change, that, wildfires are knocking out transmission lines and power plants and reducing options for out-of-state power. Droughts are affecting hydropower. That's a very different issue than the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. So I don't know, I think it is a very big issue affecting reliability and will be increasingly so. So I think it's worth including explicitly how climate change itself is impacting reliability, not just our need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
That's a good point. And we kind of believe that some of those impacts were going to be implicitly covered and captured upstream of the program itself. and I might be splitting hairs there. Niels might have some input on that, but good point, and we will do our best to capture in our next iteration.
Thank you.
So Brian Beering, you're unmuted.
Hi, this is Brian Beering for American Clean Power. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. My question is on the framing and following on the February 2022 decision. One of the things we were watching for in the procurement policy was the consideration of long lead time resources. It sounded like from Neil's kind of framing that it wasn't really included as part of this proposal, and certainly didn't see it in the policy paper. So I was wondering, it sounded like from the decision that, that was going to happen on a parallel track. Is it happening in this part of the policy paper? Is it part of the need determination? Is the need determination inclusive of the entire need? Is there going to be some sort of other set aside for long lead time resources? Can kind of help us think through how those resources are included in this.
Yeah. Hi, Brian. Yeah, sorry to truck going past, but I think you're asking how to connect what I said to the February decision, which talked about advancing procurement of long lead time resources. I think, yeah, the decision language says either do it via special rules in the program or in parallel with the program. And so what we put in the paper here is a way of doing it in parallel with the program. And yeah, we can pick. I think once we've sort of gone through the rest of the paper, or partway through, we can. I think there'll be an appreciation of why having set asides or resource specific need determination in the midst of a program which is really trying to be attribute focused can severely complicate what's already going to be a daunting task. And I will note that, as the February decision said, the Commission intends to engage with stakeholders on offshore wind later this year. Yeah, so this is not the only happening in procurement in IRP.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that, Neil. I think one of the things we're trying to think through is the need determination. So is the need determination accounting for the entirety of what's expected to be procured, or is it some subset of that, and there's a set aside for long lead time resources? So I think that's one thing we're still trying to figure out here. So appreciate the clarification.
Kathleen, you're unmuted.
Thank you. Can you hear me? It's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
We can.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for this and the kind of giving this space to level set too. So in that spirit, I just had a quick question on what you mean by the phrasing that you guys used on when you were talking about the externalities. Do you mind going into that slide? Yeah, perfect. So the language here, unconstrained energy market, I thought could be understood a few different ways. So in the spirit of having the same, understanding going through the rest of the workshop, I was just wondering if you could define what you mean by unconstrained energy market. That might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it means basically without regulatory intervention. So in the case of the reliability externality, for example, the existence of offer caps in the CAISO market leads us to a place where there's reliability externality. So new generators can't fully recover their fixed cost necessarily, given the cap on wholesale market prices, and even with some revenue coming from the RA program's near-term capacity requirements. That's where we're seeing the need for regulatory intervention, in essence, so mandatory mid to long-term contracting of reliability. So that's hopefully getting at this kind of concept of an unconstrained energy market. So absent additional regulation, that reliability externality will persist.
So Neil, if I can follow up, because I heard you, and maybe this was the source of my confusion. So when I think of unconstrained, I think of markets without caps or without mitigation, but the CAISO's day-ahead and real-time market do have caps and do have local market power mitigation. But what I heard you just say is the presence of the cap may restrict the ability to fully recover going forward costs, such that there needs to be some intervention in the forward space. Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, and I think my example of a cap is probably unfortunate. I think the unconstrained language here is like a broad term. And just for we do have the appendix, which goes into each of the externalities in a bit more detail than the body of the paper, and more detail than we'll be covering shortly.
No, this is very helpful, and I'll spend more time on the appendix. I found that this helps me understand why I found the wording a bit confusing if it's meant more broadly. So thank you for level setting up front.
And thank you for highlighting that, Kathleen. Actually, it's just a broader trend that we noticed internally while trying to develop the paper is the need for really strict term control. So we'll be extra careful going forward, but thank you.
Thank you.
I think we can move on to the next section, Neil. I don't see any more questions.
Okay. Yeah, look, so the headline summary of this section of the paper is that, as just mentioned, we've got a reliability externality. New generators not necessarily able to recover their fixed costs, even with the capacity payments coming through from the near-term RA program. And so to address this, we need mandatory mid to long-term contracting by LSEs for reliability, and making it attribute-oriented. So think of reliability certificates rather than more specific requirements will make it more economically efficient. So that's the headline of what the section is getting at. And it walks through those fundamental elements that Lauren introduced and which I'll now sort of dive into now. So a lot of content here, bear with me, and then we'll pause for questions. So on the next slide, I think a good way to start is looking at what's happening right now in the IRP proceeding in the planning track. And so right now, LSEs are preparing their individual IRPs that are due in November this year. And this requires LSEs to be considering about their reliability requirements. And so to fulfill their planning, they need to have basically two key questions or two key points to think about. What's their reliability requirement by year? So what annual LSE level effective megawatt reliability obligation? And then what are the resource counting metrics they can use by year for each of the resource types they're considering including in their plans? And essentially, do they have enough of those resources and with their counting to meet their requirement? So the table here is pulled from the resource data template, the RDT that LSEs are required to use for this effort. And just to quickly orient folks, so across the page are the years in their planning horizon, and then down the page, would be an aggregation of all the individual contracts that they include in their plans, and also resources that are not yet contracted that they have planned out in their plans. And so then this table would aggregate their all those resources into their contract statuses, so ranging from online and contracted through to development resources, so they're contracted but not yet online. And then the later rows are not yet contracted resources. And so then, at the bottom row of the table, we'll show the LLC whether they're meeting their reliability requirement. So we'll come back to this slide in a few moments regarding how to think about taking something like this into a procurement program context. So out of the planning track and into procurement. And I'll just note that section 5, which we're talking about now, is about reliability, designing for reliability, and it does set up a number of concepts which are applicable in the GHG reduction section that James will talk about later on. They're not necessarily repeated in that section, but in other words, one should read both sections together. So on the next slide, more about the recent IRP filing requirements and the modeling work that sits behind them and that could sit behind a program. Some more about loss of load probability modeling, LLP modeling. It underpins most of the reliability section of the paper. Quick overview of what we mean by this. So step 1 in loss of load probability modeling is we need to have a robust data set. So we need long historical record of correlated load, weather, and renewable output. And so that we can then simulate the system under a broad range of weather conditions. We also need detailed operating parameters and the outage characteristics of all the resources that we're modeling. Step 2, we then would simulate the system with different levels of resources to draw out the curve that's shown here. So the loss of load expectation, the x-axis is the effective capacity of the portfolio. And so by simulating the system with different levels of resources, we can draw out that curve and then find where it meets the reliability standard, which is currently 0.1 loss of load expectation, or in other words, 1 day in 10 years. And then where that intersects the x-axis is the effective capacity that's needed for a reliable system, and that can be converted into a PRM if desired. And then step 3 is the reason. This is basically how do we count resources to that standard that I just spoke about. Sort of a 3-step process where you're at a reliable system, 0.1 there, and then you add or remove resources to the system, a particular resource to the system that you're trying to find the ELCC for, and then you can add or remove perfect capacity until you get back to the reliability standard, and that determines the ELCC of that resource type. And by ELCC, the effective load carrying capability, we're referring to the expected contribution to reliability that resource type would have in a given period relative to its nameplate capacity. So a bit of background there, and please refer more to our work in the IRP planning track on this and the LLC's work in progress. So then on the next slide, diving into need determination for reliability, there are 3 main questions here. I've really been delving into technical method already there, talking about loss of load probability modeling. Alternative methods could be deterministic. So what I described was stochastic. Think of Monte Carlo simulations. Alternative methods could be deterministic, probably simpler, perhaps focusing on extreme events and analyzing those. Or there could be some hybrid approaches, drawing from both concepts. And the slice of day approach in the RA proceeding is perhaps one of those. The second question in need determination is how to express the need. So the example I just walked through there was in terms of effective capacity. And that can be, we talk about perfect capacity or PCAP. There is alternatively could be done in terms of install capacity, ICAP. And that would involve basically a combination of assuming install capacity for firm resources and ELCCs for non resources. And then the third way of expressing the reliability need the paper mentions is in firm energy terms. So for the standardized fixed price forward energy contracting approach, SFPFC, a method would be needed to translate from the effective capacity I just spoke about to define the need in firm energy terms. Third big question with reliability need determination is the scope of the need. In particular, the paper explores basically whether it's all resources, whether it's existing and new resources only, or some sort of hybrid. And all resources would essentially allow existing and new resources to compete for contracts to determine market entry and exit. Whereas a new only approach to this would continue the IRP approach of ordering new, but in a programmatic way. So it would not facilitate direct competition between existing and resources. It would involve the CPUC having to make assumptions about how many existing resources will remain. And it would have the sort of retention challenge for existing resources being addressed by the CAISO wholesale market and the RA program's near-term contracting requirements. And so the hybrid approach mentioned there at the end there, existing and new resources would also not be in direct competition because there would be a separate obligation for new resources that would need to be defined. And then on to need allocation, picking up where Lauren introduced that. Two main things to consider here. So it's how do we take that need determination for each LSE? And really in reliability, we in the paper, we essentially say it really depends on the next step. I'm going to talk about compliance and what accounting rule we're going to use for compliance. That probably helps know what approach to take for need allocation. I mean, in general, it ought to be based on causation. So, essentially, the larger the LSE, the larger the procurement role they should play, to put it simplistically. But so what that means specifically for reliability, it comes back to, I think, our choice of compliance accounting. So if it's average ELCCs that we use, and I'll talk about that shortly, then we could use managed peak share. So the LSE's share of the managed peak, similar to the current RA program approach, but using a long-term forecast of each LSE's managed peak share. If instead a marginal ELCC approach is taken for resource counting, then an improvement at the need allocation step here could be to utilize the LSE's load share during the net peak instead of the managed peak. In other words, the system load after accounting for both customer solar, utility scale wind, and possibly even other non-firm resources like energy storage. So the idea here is that while the managed peak already captures some shift of reliability challenge conditions to the later evening, using net peak share would more precisely align the allocation of the need with the hours of greatest system stress. The third sub-bullet there is about the slice of day approach. So if we're using a 24-hour approach, it's essentially a bottom-up LSE by LSE centric approach to need allocation. So there isn't a clear single system need that then is determined and then allocated at this step. Need determination is somewhat sort of grounded in the loss of load probability based modeling, and then has some deterministic features. And so each, as we say here, each LSE would meet their load forecast plus a reserve margin at a granular level, and it's hourly in the case of the current RA program. Allocating, if we're in using firm energy contracts, for example, according to the standardized fixed price forward energy contracting approach, there could be a method to allocate the firm megawatt hours need based on each LSE's share of peak load or their share of energy. Okay, and then there's the second broad topic of need allocation, is just how often would it be updated? So as Lauren said, we're talking programmatic, meaning rolling, ongoing requirements. And so it's a matter of then how often would LSEs be informed of their updated forward requirements driven by load forecast changes. And so, I mean, we pose basically that it would be best to just align that with the frequency of their compliance showings. So, for example, annually. And just noting that this process of a rolling approach to updating need allocation would somewhat address load migration. Okay, then on the compliance element of reliability. Okay, so yeah, we're talking about resource counting. How much does each resource count towards an LSE's allocated need? Three broad approaches here: effective capacity base, slice of day, firm energy. So just focusing on within the effective capacity base in this table here, different ELCC types. Okay, so we could use a marginal ELCC to count resources. So the resources are credited at their marginal reliability contribution. The procurement need, to make this work, the procurement need ought to be adjusted from a total reliability need to a marginal reliability need. I think that this terminology might not be intuitive, and I want to emphasize that it doesn't mean that this is just the need for new resources. We would define marginal reliability need as the sum of the marginal ELCC megawatts for all resources in the system, existing and expected new. So pros of this would be that, you know, marginal value provides an efficient investment signal for marginal resource decisions. So what resource to add to the system or retire from the system. For example, what's the reliability value of adding another solar farm? Another pro, we think it's feasible to implement. The broad con of this one is that it assigns less credit to specific LSEs for their past procurement. So that brings us to an average ELCC option, and that credits resources at their total reliability contribution. So procurement need here would be total reliability need, which I sort of introduced earlier. And the pro here is that it assigns more credit to specific LSEs for their past procurement. So, for example, in the case of those solar farms, you know, which LSE bought the solar that lowered and shifted the net peak. It's also feasible to implement. However, the main con is it's not as economically efficient in terms of the investment signal it provides relative to a marginal ELCC approach. And then the third row here, vintage marginal, which is essentially marginal, but then vintaging them upon market entry. So that would require basically a record to be kept of the vintage of each ELCC set. Again, we'd use the procurement need being the total reliability need. It provides an efficient signal. Cons are it's complex to implement. And then unlike the other two approaches, otherwise identical resources would be differently credited or counted towards reliability just based on their online date. Okay, so this is a live topic in the IRP planning track. I mentioned earlier, LSEs are currently required to use marginal ELCCs in their plans due in November. And so I've only glossed over this matter, and we have detailed slides and webinar recordings on the 2022 IRP events and materials webpage. So then just touching on slice of day, the RA program's implementation of resource counting, it's currently in progress, and it depends on the resource type. It differs a little bit depending on the resource type. So, if we had to generalize how it might work in a mid to long-term procurement context, we could say the resource counting would be based on each resource's expected availability in each slice of the day. And in fact, it could be an open question whether hourly slices would be optimal for the context here, or something less granular. Then just diving into the firm energy approach and how resource counting could look in that. So, I would say again, the SFPFC is one approach to reliability procurement based around a firm energy compliance requirement. It's the one that we refer to in the paper. There might be other ways of having mandatory firm energy contracting. And the way we explain it is that one SFPFC contract would be defined as 1 megawatt hour of energy over the compliance period, so say a year. And that the hourly shape of that contract is retroactively adjusted based on the realized system load. So an example here, in a system where the annual load turns out to be, so actual system load turns out to be 1 million megawatt hours, and hour 1 was 500 megawatt hours, hours 2 was 1,000 megawatt hours. One SFPFC would be those values shown in the table in hour 1 and hour 2 and so on. So totaling 1 megawatt hour across the year. So each LSC's allocated firm energy procurement need would be in terms of a certain number of SFPFCs for the compliance period. And we highlight that because the contractual quantity here is based on realized system load, LSCs would still need to consider their own risk management and product innovation to affect the difference between system load and their own load shapes. But we use system load here in order to standardize. And then the significance of realized shape rather than a precise quantity that's known upfront in the contract in advance. The idea here is to reduce the incentive for the supplier to offer the portion of their supply that's in excess at significantly high prices. So, I'm referring to the CAISO wholesale market, and reduce so-called hockey stick offer curves where the supplier, the generator, offers basically marginal cost bids up to the contracted quantity they're serving, and then much higher bids once the contracted quantity is covered. If the contract is defined to be based on realized load, that will reduce the incentive in theory of the supplier to bid like that. And then tying that all back to resource counting, so the LSCs or their suppliers would need to show that the underlying resources behind those SFPFCs, owned or contracted, are sufficient to support the contract. And this would be based on the same loss of load probability modeling described earlier to calculate each resource type's ELCC and then translate that into firm energy equivalent. And here's a simple example: a 1 megawatt nameplate resource with an annual ELCC of 10%. So multiply 1 by 10% by 8,760, and that means that resource is eligible to sell up to 876 SFPFC contracts. Up to that level. Okay, and now moving to the final point on reliability compliance, and hopefully this helps pull out some of the ideas in the paper into more of a visual. So just starting with the chart on the right here, orienting folks. The x-axis is the year of need, so looking out from T+0, say, which is the current year, to 10 years ahead. The y-axis is on the primary y-axis is the planned and procured resources in terms of effective megawatts that the LSC has planned and procured for. That the secondary y-axis is the fraction of the need that they're required to cover. And then the columns in the stacked charts there are, so the stacked portions are firstly in the sort of beige color are the online resources they've got in their portfolio that are contracted. The green are development resources, so contracted but not yet online. And then the crosshatch blue are planned resources, so they're not contracted. So what's this chart showing? So basically this LSC in this example is using a combination of online and development resources to meet the volume of need required to be covered by the program. The planned resources on top of these ensures it's compliant in an IRP planning track context, but those blue resources up the top right, they don't count towards program compliance. They're not contracted. And so then looking at the table, which is what the chart's based off, yeah, just reminding this is basically drawn from the resource data template that I showed earlier. It's adapted a bit here to what conceptually we could have in a program context. The green shaded rows there are sort of relevant to the planning track, whereas the bold rows are what would matter for the new program. So the LSC in the planning track is required to plan 10 more years out. But then the program design would say, okay, what portion of that future need does actually have to have contracts for into the future? And so that's where the bold numbers show up. So yeah, the result you can see in the bottom line is that the LSC has a positive net capacity position, so it's compliant with the program. So a lot there. I mean, and I think the paper puts out this illustrative approach just to start the conversation. Is forward coverage of 10 years appropriate? Is 100% coverage for the first 5 years declining to 25% by year 10 appropriate? I mean, these questions go to trade-offs between providing sufficient investment signals to have new resources compete with existing versus giving LSCs flexibility. That's the trade-off. And as a sense check, one could look at an LSC that's currently in the midst of its midterm reliability procurement order procurement for D21-06035, which requires 10-year long contracts. And one could see if they were to make showings, say, today for the new program, what portion of their year T+10 reliability need is covered by those. Yeah, so one of many areas we're seeking feedback from stakeholders on. And then looking at other bullets at the top here of this slide, proof of contracting frequency, I won't go into, the paper does, but I just call out the question of persistence of the attributes. And, this is a possible issue of a program which has a scope of driving new resource procurement only, as opposed to allowing existing resources to compete, is what keeps a resource serving CAISO load once it rolls off the initial contract. So a new resource could be brought on, shown, and even not just once it's rolled off its contract, but an LSC could show it for compliance, and perhaps then it gets picked up by a load outside the CAISO system. These are broad concepts here and on this slide, and I think they're equally applicable with the alternatives of firm energy and slice of day compliance that are also discussed in the paper. This slide is sort of a capacity oriented approach to things, but yeah, broad concepts applicable in the other ways too. Final piece of reliability reliability design is what would enforcement look like? Lauren's already given the intro of what enforcement means. So the paper in reliability goes into, okay, specifically what could trigger enforcement to be needed. And it lists out various stages of when it might become necessary. It's not exhaustive, it's just to advance the conversation. Basically forward-looking type triggers. So think of the chart I just showed earlier and an LSC not showing sufficient coverage. But it could also be in the T+0 timeframe. Did the resource actually show up? So those could be triggers for enforcement. And I also just repeat or emphasize that enforcement is foundational to program, and reliability in particular. Well, to reliability, we can't afford for LLCs that fail to meet their obligations to threaten grid reliability. It goes as a whole. So that's hopefully clear in the paper. And then touching on the various forms of enforcement, we've detailed financial penalties, so possibly a net cone with a multiplier. This is in aid of ensuring that the cost of not complying is more than the cost of complying. That's familiar from the MTR order and the RA program, that kind of concept, although the details are different. A particular feature of the SFPFC approach is mentioned in the paper, and it would have broad application in that the more contracts are standardized, the more we can have quality control and an understanding of what will actually show up. And so there could be feasibility checks as real-time approaches for that contract, and checking that the underlying resources are sufficient to meet the obligations. If there's a standardized contract, there's probably the opportunity to have less explicit penalties and leave it to the market dynamics to have the same effect on the suppliers. So that's what this bullet's getting at, is that a contract that's found to have insufficient resources standing behind it, that supplier would need to sell that contract down, likely at a discount to its original awarded price. Non-financial enforcement is mentioned in the paper as possibly being appropriate. For example, a loss of a license to retail for repeated willingness to basically pay the penalty rather than comply. And then the paper describes backstop. Lauren explained what backstop means. Staff expected would be necessary for reliability, and it's about a few considerations here. In particular, are when would you trigger backstop, and so there's a trade-off between making sure that backstop procurement can occur in time, versus giving the non-compliant LLC a chance to get back into compliance while paying penalties. There's a question of who the backstop entity or entities would be. And then costs would need to be assigned to the deficient LLCs. And we've got the modified mod-CAM method that's used for the first two IRP procurement orders. And so the paper questions whether that's suitable in a program context. For one thing, it doesn't address the possibility of load migration after backstop is triggered. And there's some more detail on that in the paper. That concludes my walkthrough of Section 5. I know there's a lot there. Be great to take questions. And to recap, what this section is really saying is we've got a reliability externality. To address this, we need mandatory mid to long-term contracting by LLCs for reliability, and making it attribute-oriented. Think of reliability certificates rather than more specific procurement requirements will make it more economically efficient.
Thanks for that, Neil. For one of the densest sections of slides we've ever presented in an IRP program, I'm surprised that we only have 5 hands up right now, but let's try to get through them. I think we have Doug Carper first. Doug, you're unmuted.
Peninsula Clean Energy. I had actually 3 fairly unrelated questions. So maybe I don't know if you want them all
Doug,
together.
a favor, if you could pick your favorite and put the 2 others in the Q&A, and we'll deal with them that way.
Okay, that sounds good. I think probably the first, my favorite one would be, for the 5-year timeline of, or how far out are people showing contracts? What provision are you envisioning for the role of short-term PPAs for managing market risk and for managing particularly technology risk? So big concern that shows up. If you want everybody to procure early, then we're locking ourselves into 2022 technologies. And of course, most LSEs use short-term PPAs, 1 to 2 years, quite a bit. So I'm just wondering how you envision the reality of the market interacting with that.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Doug. I can just take a quick response and invite others to. I think that's a tension that I tried to call out. It's a question of trade-off between flexibility and providing sufficient investment signal for new resources. So, yeah, I mean, if we think of that slide earlier with the column charts, short-term PPAs could certainly be used for those near-term showings, like T+3 sort of time frame. But they wouldn't suffice for T+7. So like while an LSE may plan to just continue having short-term contracting and include that in the IRP plan for the planning track, that wouldn't cut it in a program context. But yeah, you get at that question, like what is the right, how to trade off as I described.
Yeah, Doug, it might be helpful in comments if you have, if you want to develop your thoughts more on that, because to Neil's point, it would be naive of us to assume that 100% of this could be covered by long-term contracts, and there wouldn't be a place for tools that are, say, doing smaller jobs to cover up gaps. But we're open to ideas. I think Nuo Tang was next. Nuo, you are unmuted.
Middle River Power. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for the presentation. My main question is, in July, the IRP team did a sort of analysis using perfect capacity or PCAP. And here there's mention of marginal ELCC, average ELCC, and vintaged ELCC. I'm wondering whether the marginal ELCC is similar to the PCAP that you all had presented in July, and if not, why isn't PCAP an option here? Thank you.
Thanks, Nuo. Yeah, I'll take a go at this and then invite Aaron to share. But basically, I wasn't actually. I barely spoke about PRM in all this. So I sort of see PRM as a derivative of the reliability need that's found through the loss of load modeling. And then the LCC conversation is all about how to count resources towards that. And what we're saying in the paper is we need common methodology, common resource sets, common modeling and data sets when doing both of those things. So perfect capacity PRM could be used, I think, with all three of these ELCC types. But yeah, I invite Aaron to develop that further.
Yeah, so I'll just share to ground folks that perfect capacity and effective capacity and ELCC all mean the same thing. They are synonyms for each other. So just want to make sure folks are tracking that. In terms of the need determination stage, so if this is approached with loss of load probability modeling, as Neil laid out earlier, that starts from, it's a probabilistic simulation, and it's tied in setting the reliability need to a probabilistic reliability standard. And once you select that standard, directly out of the probabilistic modeling comes the total reliability need to meet that standard. And then that need can be defined a few different ways. So one way is to define it in its ELCC equivalent or its perfect capacity equivalent. So that's a PCAP definition of need. If you define the need in that way, then you have to count all of the resources against that need at their perfect capacity equivalent or their ELCC. The other way you could do it is an installed capacity or ICAP method. That's the way the RA program accounting has been done in the past that uses ELCC for some resources, installed the capacity for other resources. And yeah, we presented earlier this year in the planning track why moving towards a ELCC definition for all might provide a more level playing field and efficient market signal. And then once you define that need, actually any of these ELCC flavors, if you will, those can all be used towards a PCAP need definition.
So let's move to Nancy Rader.
California Wind Energy Association. On your slide 15, I think it was, on need allocation, I just wondered, in 2019, we had an addition to the code on need allocations saying essentially that we should allocate to LSCs based on their causation for the need for RA resources. And I wondered if you considered which of your proposed methods would, or all, would comport with that.
I think what the paper proposes is quite simple in that we don't attempt to consider, unlike the MTR order and the ruling that led up to that, we didn't explore contracting position, as we called it, along with load share to arrive at a need allocation. The paper is much more simple in that regard. It is it's effectively based on load share. Now, the matter that you raised, Nancy, doesn't go away. It just means that we're proposing to have that treated as part of compliance. And so, yeah, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on how to have that part of the code be implemented at the compliance step.
And so Nancy, if nothing more to share now, I think, especially in the interest of time, we will keep moving, but happy to continue the conversation. So we'll do Nick Pappas, and then we've got 3 other questions from Scott Olson, Maren Wenzel, and Mary Neal. We're going to ask the 3 of you to move down to the lower right, those 3 dots. Please use the Q&A function to type your question in, and we'll deal with it as the rest of the presentation is moving forward. Nick, you should be unmuted.
Can you hear me?
It's a little faint, but yes.
Apologies, let me switch to my Nathan, can you hear me?
That's better, yes.
Oh, sorry about the technical difficulties. This is Nick Pappas. I'm a consultant with the Natural Resources Defense Council. So first off, just want to say thank you to the whole team for bringing this forward. I think getting an integrated and streamlined approach to procurement will be really beneficial. So eager to jump into this with you all. So my question is a little bit related to Aaron's discussion of some of the counting methodologies. I think one inherent tension in this process is the effort to create sort of forward-looking analysis around an indicative portfolio while giving some flexibility to LSCs to potentially deviate from the procurement that's identified in that portfolio. And there's a lot of interdependency and impact of that for how does that portfolio come back together? Does it hit the reliability requirement, the GHG requirement, et cetera? That's going to have significant implications then for the counting rules as well. And I guess my question or comment is, have you thought about, or would it be helpful to sort of develop the record around which of these counting structures is going to provide the most durability year to year in ensuring that the resources brought back by LSEs actually add back up to that sort of indicative portfolio we hoped for, so we don't have to do a lot of iterative correction or sort of strand resources that maybe were aligned with the static ELCC results in year 1, but are kind of no longer correct in year 3 once the procurement has come back. So would love any thoughts on that now, or otherwise just want to sort of flag that as a theme for discussion as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think we would love to hear more of your thoughts on that. We do have thinking on, and I think it's in the paper, about how to make sure the counting, the resource counting is updated regularly, as you indicated. As resource mix changes, resource counting values do too. So yeah, common. But I think we'll get to it later in the deck, but we envisage an ongoing and regular interaction between the planning track findings in that regard and then what it means for a procurement program. It'd be great to develop more ideas on that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. So we're a few minutes past on this Q&A. Again, I'll redirect folks that did not have their questions answered yet to the 3 dots in the lower right and use the Q&A function. Please don't use the chat function that's right next to it. I know that's a little bit confusing, but please use the 3 dots in the Q&A function. Should we move on to the next section?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nathan, and thanks, Neil, for presenting on reliability. So I'm going to go through a few slides on designing program design considerations for optimizing greenhouse gas reduction. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to start by talking about how GHG emissions are currently handled in the IRP planning track before getting into some options for how the GHG reduction aspects of this program could be designed. So this slide is meant to help establish some of the concepts that we'll be addressing in the program options. So at the start, so currently within the IRP planning track, at the start of each cycle, the Commission sets a GHG target for the electric sector and then assigns individual LSE GHG benchmarks to each LSE. These are targets that represent each LSE's share of the electric sector target, and it is the target that they have to plan for in their individual IRPs. So in the current IRP cycle, LSEs were instructed to file 2 plans based on 2 different electric sector targets. One is 38 million metric tons by 2030 and 30 million metric tons by 2035. The other set of targets is 30 million metric tons by 2030 and 25 million metric tons by 2035. So LSEs are in the process of developing those plans right now and thinking through what they would plan to procure in order to reach those targets. For reference, these targets are roughly equivalent to achieving about 90% clean energy by 2035 or more. So to verify that LSE plans actually would achieve their GHG benchmarks, we issue something called the Clean System Power Calculator, or CSP calculator, that all LSEs need to submit along with their standard plans, which is a Excel template tool that tells us the resulting greenhouse gas and criteria pollution emissions that would come from LSE portfolios. The CSP calculator is set up so that LSEs enter their contracted and planned renewable and clean energy supply information by resource type for each of the calculator study years, as well as their demand information for those years. And the calculator then performs a load resource balance calculation for every hour of the year to figure out how much of an LSE's demand was met with emissions-free supply in each hour and how much of its demand was met with system power. And for each megawatt hour of system power that the LSE relies on, it gets tagged at the system power emissions factor rate for that hour. And an LSE's annual emissions at the end of each year equals the sum of its hourly emissions across all 8760 hours in that year. The hourly production profiles and emissions information that are used to perform these calculations come from SERVM production cost modeling, unit level dispatch reports for the optimized 38 and 30 MMT resource portfolios. The hourly demand shapes come from the CEC's IPR, and LSEs have the ability to override these standardized shapes and enter customized hourly supply and demand information if they want to better match their actual contracts or load. So that's basically how LSE planning around emissions is handled in the planning track. After we get all 40 plus LSE plans and verify that they met their benchmarks and followed all of our other instructions, we aggregate all of those individual plans and use that to adopt a preferred system plan. The PSP, Preferred System Plan, represents the CPUC's preferred portfolio for achieving electric sector GHG and reliability goals. It's also used in the CAISO's transmission planning process to identify grid upgrades needed that would be needed to accommodate that resource portfolio. But it's important, it's really key for program design to understand that while we use LSE plans and the PSP to inform state planning, the plans themselves are indicative and LSEs retain discretion in their actual procurement. An LSE plan that includes resources sufficient to meet their GHG planning requirement is not a requirement for the LSE to go out and procure those exact resources. And that gap that exists right now between planning and procurement is part of what we're seeking to address with a programmatic procurement approach. So on the next slide, I'm showing two broad options here that are previewed in the paper. There's a mass-based GHG target approach and a clean energy standard approach. Those are the two options that the paper discusses. The mass-based approach is basically what I just described for the planning track at a high level, but with added elements of procurement compliance and enforcement rules added in. So under this approach, the CPUC would continue to set a mass-based GHG target, and LSEs would be assigned individual GHG targets representing their share of the sector-wide target, and compliance would be demonstrated through use of a procurement-specific CSP calculator. And as I just described, the calculator would have hourly granularity, where emissions outputs measured in million metric tons would reflect an LSE's ability to displace power, system power, with GHG-free energy. So this option, the mass-based target, I basically think of as programmatizing the GHG elements of the IRP planning track, using the same basic building blocks that currently exist in IRP, but customizing them for procurement with additional compliance elements added on. The other broad option proposed in the paper is a clean energy standard, or CES. So think of this basically as an RPS, but with expanded eligibility to include additional GHG-free resources that aren't necessarily RPS eligible. So under this approach, the CPUC would establish an annual clean energy as a % of retail sales target for the electric sector and for individual LSEs. And similar to the RPS program, LSEs would need to demonstrate that they contracted for a steadily increasing quantity of clean energy measured in megawatt hours, sufficient to meet their percentage target each year or at the end of a program compliance period. This option draws heavily on the existing RPS framework, which is already well understood by LSEs and market actors and has a successful track record of deploying clean energy. But while the RPS has many goals, including but not limited to reducing greenhouse gases, the CES option proposed here is more squarely focused on procurement to drive GHG reductions. One additional aspect to keep in mind for program design broadly is that while SB 100, the SB 100 law sets a 100% renewable and zero carbon goal for the state by 2045, there is not currently a regulatory framework or compliance program in place to ensure that LSEs are on track to achieve that. So as noted earlier, program design, one of the things that we're going to seek to accomplish with this program is to create a regulatory framework that can ultimately be used to help ensure that all CPUC jurisdictional LSEs are complying with the 100% goal of SB 100. So moving on, now I'm going to walk through some of the fundamental elements of the program and how they might work under different GHG options. So for need determination under the mass-based approach depicted by the declining green bars in the figure on the slide on the right, need could be based directly on the GHG targets that are set through the planning track. So for example, in the current planning track, if the GHG targets are 38 million metric tons by 2030 and 30 million metric tons by 2035, then need determination for program purposes would be 38 million metric tons by 2030 and 30 million metric tons by 2035. Under a clean energy standard approach depicted by the increasing orange line on the right-hand side, need could be based on the amount of clean energy generation projected to be needed to achieve the GHG target set in the IRP planning track. So, for example, if we have a 38 and a 30 million metric ton target in the planning track, that is the equivalent of roughly 83% clean energy by 2030 and 90% clean energy in 2035. Those were the findings of the February PSP decision. So that would then translate to setting clean energy standard need determination targets of 83% and 90% by 2030 and 2035. So I want to clarify, if it wasn't already clear, that both of these options are different approaches for characterizing the same need for GHG reductions identified in the IRP planning track. The mass-based approach would take that need directly from the planning track using the same million metric ton metric. The clean energy standard would also be taking that need from the planning track, but would add the additional step of translating the sector-wide GHG target into a % clean energy target. In other words, the green bars and the orange line in this figure represent the exact same GHG reduction need, and each one directly translates to the other at any point along the x-axis. The only difference here is the unit of need that's being expressed. So moving on to the next element, need allocation. This is how those sector level targets identified in the previous step get translated into individual LSE targets. So to help illustrate how this could work, the table here shows what sample need allocation amounts could look like under a mass-based approach shown here in green and a clean energy standard approach shown here in orange. So the mass-based need allocation methodology would be the same as what's used in the IRP planning track to set GHG benchmarks. And the table on this slide should look pretty familiar to LSEs who are used to looking up their GHG benchmarks. This table, a lot of the elements of this table come from what is on our IRP website for LSE plan development. So in this example, which is based on electric sector targets of 38 million metric tons in 2030, 30 MMT in 2035, and 48 MMT in 2026. Each LSE's need is based on their energy load share within each IOU service territory and the share of electric sector GHG emissions ascribed to each service territory. And that those emissions shares ascribed to each territory, that's something that we get from CARB's cap and trade program. So in this example, all the LSEs are in the same IOU service territory, and that territory is getting 25% of the electric sector need determination. That means that 25% of the allowable GHG emissions would get allocated to all of these LSEs, and then each LSE's individual target is based on their projected load share within that service territory. So the IOU in this example with 55% load share in 2030 gets 55% of the service territory emissions target in 2030. CCA number 2 with 3% load share in 2035 gets assigned 3% of the emissions target in 2035. Again, this is how the process already works in the IRP planning track. The clean energy standard need allocation process is a little bit more straightforward in some ways because each LSE's target would be the exact same percentage target as what we set during need determination. So in this example, since need allocation is expressed as an annual percentage target of clean energy generation that each LSE needs to procure as a share of their retail sales, each sample LSE has the same need allocation amount in each year based on the overall CES target. For each LSE, the amount that they actually have to go out and procure would be their retail sales multiplied by the target. So moving on to the next slide, the next element that I'm going to go through is compliance, which is where the rubber really meets the road in terms of turning these options into a compliance program. Both of the options proposed in the staff paper contain a mix of forward contracting and backwards looking compliance aspects. So I'll start off by walking through some potential compliance elements of a mass-based compliance program before turning to a clean energy standard option on the next slide. And before I get going, I just want to remind everyone that as Neil was mentioning on the reliability slide, a lot of this is indicative and meant to spark discussion and start to get people thinking about how the compliance program could actually work. But we are definitely looking for stakeholder feedback as we narrow in on what the actual details would be. So the forward contracting elements of the mass-based option would be defined as the amount of procurement that an LSE needs to have under contract sufficient to meet their future GHG targets as demonstrated in their CSP calculators. The exact percentage of forward contracting and how many years ahead LSEs need to show forward contracts for are all things that would have to be figured out as part of program design. Again, we're welcoming party comments on that topic, but the illustrative example depicted here is one where 100% of the 5-year ahead LSE need would be required to be under contract, and that declines to 25% of LSE need 10 years ahead. So how might that actually look to an LSE looking 5 to 10 years out is depicted by these figures on the left-hand side, like the ones that Neil showed for reliability. Along the x-axis, you've got T plus 0 going out to T plus 10 years ahead. So, and along the y-axis is the percent of need that has to be shown by forward contracting. So in year 0, looking 5 years ahead, an LSE would need to show that they have sufficient contracts in place to achieve 100% of their greenhouse gas target. Again, this would be demonstrated by submitting CSP calculators that achieve the LSE's GHG target 5 years ahead that are populated only with resources that the LSE has under contract. For 6 to 10 years out, the LSE would still need to show that they have contracts in place, but they wouldn't need to be meeting that 10-year ahead target with just contracted resources. You can see in that bottom right-hand graph that after 5 years, it starts to diverge, where the solid line target continues to decrease, but an LSE in year 0 would have to show a shrinking proportion of that target getting met with contracted resources and could fill in the remainder of the reductions needed through more speculative planned resources submitted in the planning track. So if these forward contracting requirements are meant to show and get LSE sufficiently contracted with resources to achieve the GHG targets, the backward-looking compliance elements would be needed to show that LSEs actually brought online or kept online the resources that they included, that they contracted for. So there are a few different flavors of what that could look like under a mass-based approach that differ in terms of complexity and analytical rigor. The most granular backward-looking option discussed in the paper would be requiring LSEs to actually use a backwards-looking CSP calculator configured with actual historical loads, actual resource availability, and thermal dispatch to measure whether LSE portfolios actually met their GHG targets based on actual system conditions in a historical year. Another option would be to somehow integrate the backwards-looking compliance with the CEC's Power Content Label program to match the historical emissions content of each LSE against their GHG targets. That option could help connect IRP with the Power Content Label, which is a positive, but it would also require more upfront interagency coordination and emissions accounting methodology alignment. So there would be some upfront work needed there. Another maybe lighter touch backwards-looking compliance check could be a simple assessment of whether LSEs actually did bring online or kept online all of the resources that they included as contracted in their forward showing CSP calculators. But ultimately, as I was saying, the goal here is to use a mix of forward and backward showings to ensure that LSEs are sufficiently contracted to achieve their GHG targets and successfully brought those resources online. There are different flavors of how that can be accomplished. Those are discussed in more detail in the paper, and we look forward to getting more party comment and suggestions here. So moving on, for a clean energy standard, there would be a similar set of compliance design considerations. And the paper explores a mix of forward and backward compliance approaches to ensure that contracting is occurring and resources are being brought online. Like the mass-based approach, the forward contracting elements of this option could be defined as the amount of procurement that an LSE needs to have under contract, sufficient to meet their future CES target. And also, like the mass-based approach, the exact percentage of forward contracting and how many years ahead LSEs need to show forward contracts for are all things that need to be figured out as part of program design. The illustrative example depicted here contains less of a forward contracting requirement than the mass-based approach. So here, 50% of the 5-year ahead LSE need could be required to be under contract, declining to 12.5% 10 years ahead. So this is just half of the forward contracting requirement that I just showed for the other option. And that means that in year 0, an LSE would need to show they have sufficient contracts 5 years ahead to achieve 50% of their CES target, and then a gradually declining amount would have to be shown for those further out years. So what that means, with a reduced forward contracting requirement, that would place more emphasis on the backwards-looking compliance check. And what we've put forward for a clean energy standard is that, like the RPS, the compliance check could be based on retiring credits, which we're calling here zero emissions credits, representing 1 megawatt hour of clean energy generation. So this backwards-looking credit-based approach, locking up less of the compliance in forward contracts, would allow for more flexibility for LSEs and more fungibility of the compliance product, and open up more possibilities for compliance pathways. And while all the elements of backwards-looking credit-based compliance structures aren't fully described here or in the paper, the general principle that we're putting forward would be to borrow as many concepts and replicate the RPS program design to the extent feasible when setting this up. Different compliance concepts that could be brought in include program periods to allow for interannual variability in loads and resources, a Regis-based certification system for the zero emissions credits to create and track credit generation, eligibility rules surrounding RECs, program design, renewable energy credits, which are used in RPS. Program design would need to consider if RPS RECs can be used to comply with the clean energy standard, and then if so, which product content category buckets would qualify. For reference, in the IRP planning track, only PCC1 and PCC0 RECs are counted as GHG free in LSE plans and their CSP calculators. We would also be considering banking rules for excess zero emission credits and resource eligibility rules to define which technologies beyond those that already qualify for the RPS would be eligible for clean energy standard program compliance. In considering, so as LSEs are considering a clean energy standard option and what compliance could look like there, we encourage them to think of how the RPS program currently works and how its design elements could be applied in developing an IRP procurement program for GHGs. If there are positive or negative aspects of that program that aren't discussed in the paper that you think should inform IRP program design, then we're happy to hear that. The last program element that I'll discuss before pausing for questions is enforcement or the penalties for non-compliance, which is a concept that Lauren established earlier on. Non-compliance in this context can include an LSE failing to meet its forward contract or backward-looking requirements, and either of the GHG program design options would require a set penalty schedule and structure to be assessed on an LSE for their GHG or clean energy shortfall. Under the mass-based approach, the paper suggested the penalty could be defined in terms of dollar per ton for GHG emissions in excess of the GHG target, under a clean energy standard approach, penalties could be expressed in terms of a dollar per megawatt basis for each megawatt hour shortfall of the LSE's requirement. Like all the other aspects of program design, there are many different flavors of enforcement that could be developed, and we'll have to consider questions such as whether there should be a cap on total penalties assessed, some kind of cost cap, whether and how penalty structure might differ if LSEs have met their forward contracting requirements, but fails in its backward-looking compliance check. And then sort of a related concept to that is whether penalties would be reduced or waived if an LSE can show good cause for missing its targets, such as project delays that might have happened beyond the LSE's control. So those types of considerations would have to be thought through. So that is my overview of the paper's GHG program design options, and I think we can open things up for questions now, Nathan.
Yeah, James, I think we've only got a few hands up, a few more in the Q&A, but before doing that, I actually do want to remind folks of some nuance, just where we are process and timeline-wise here in the broader conversation of developing this program. So what we're here to discuss is an options paper, but I'm kind of reading between the lines in some of the questions. There might be some feelings out there in stakeholder land where we're either expressing preferences, even staff proposals, showing policy preferences, those sorts of things, which I don't think we're quite at that step yet. The next step in the process was after this for everyone to basically sharpen their pencils for comments, replies. We'd take all that information in, and then we'd be whittling things down into a staff proposal later on that folks could respond to in a more kind of direct sense of what is staff really proposing here. What we're really trying to do now with this conversation, with this paper, is sketch out something that's considerably more broad, which is kind of the set of options, the universe of things that one could consider after we had thought about it for a while. Of what could you do? What could you consider when developing a program like this? Sorry if we hadn't made that clear enough before. I'm glad that we had a moment now. But let's dig into some more questions. So I think Deborah Bayless, you are unmuted. Deborah, I'm going to try again.
Hello.
There we go.
Okay. Hi, this is Deborah Bayless representing the California Environmental Justice Alliance. First of all, thank you for this presentation. It's very helpful to walk through the staff paper. My question is, in addition to the requirement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the code also has a requirement to minimize air pollution with a priority for disadvantaged communities. Is there a way that that is expected to be integrated into this proposal related to greenhouse gas emissions or other aspects of the proposal? And how will that, are there any proposals for how that requirement could be enforced?
So I can take like the first crack at it, and anyone else jump in if you want. Deborah, that's a great question, and I think there are ways that you could theoretically build that into a program. I can opine a little bit on it right now, but definitely welcome any more detailed comments or suggestions you want to submit. The two basic approaches on GHGs, which are to look at the IRP planning track and essentially programatize the Clean System Power Calculator, or to copy as many of the elements of the RPS program as possible. Both of those programs have disadvantaged community and air pollution considerations already. So I think that would be the starting point of considering what our options are. And then, from there, it would be a question of how much farther do we want to go? What should get built into compliance, into a compliance framework? So in the CSP calculator, for example, there are outputs for both GHG emissions. There are also outputs for criteria air pollutant emissions. So that is part of the calculator. I do caution that at the moment, I don't think that those, you know, as our documentation for the calculator says, the air pollution results are basically directional. They're not granular enough to, you know, for us to stand behind them and say that this would be the air pollution impact. So I think we would need more, I think, analytical granularity to be able to stand behind the numbers themselves in the calculator. But directionally, I think they do a good job. And then in the RPS program, you know, there's a least cost best fit type methodology that includes outreach to disadvantaged communities and minimizing environmental impacts. So yeah, I would offer those as starting points of the conversation, and then I think program design should be considering what gets built into this program and what gets expanded and refined.
Yeah, so I think James just described some starting points, Deborah. We'd be really curious about your thoughts and comments about, okay, you articulated the starting point, staff, but some more details needed here, it's needed there, and we're more than happy to work offline to figure out how to implement as best possible, because we take that line of our statute very seriously. But thank you, Deborah. I think next would be Mary Lynch. Mary, if you're having trouble, see you're unmuted. Can you hear us now? So Mary, maybe circle back and put your next question in the Q&A bar in the lower right. We're going to have to move on. Kathleen Colbert.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks, Nathan. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I had a question that, I hear what you're saying about this being staff option paper, but there's one piece of it that jumped out at me as not super optional, and I was wondering if I could ask a question about that. What I'm getting at is going through the effort of thinking through and refining what resources meet clean energy. That seems to be something that we have to do based on the kind of where the legislative requirements are pretty silent on what is clean energy for the SB 100 and then the new legislation that just got approved. So I'm reading into your paper that rather than waiting for legislation to define the clean energy, that a part of this effort, perhaps the regulatory proceeding defines what is eligible for clean energy to meet these different percent targets over time. And I don't want to, and so I wanted to tease out, am I reading that correctly? Do you think this is the right venue? Is this a part of this process, or is that something you defer for another phase after program details are set up? Does that question make sense? Just trying to get a sense of.
Kathleen, it does. And I think back to my statement from a couple minutes ago that we're trying to articulate the universe of options to pick from. If you think that we are have articulated the wrong set of options and that we should be looking outside of that universe, or that we mischaracterize something, by all means, please do put it in comments. But I think your question is, would a program like this be waiting for ledge-based direction on defining what's eligible versus just taking action to define on its own? And I'd say you could look back at CPUC programs that have basically run the gamut between those two ends of the spectrum about what's appropriate and what's not. So if you feel like there's an authority or a lack of authority that we have to do so, please do let us know in comments so we know not to say get ahead of our skis.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I probably need an attorney to look at that. But my sense is that it would be more productive for the regulatory venue. So for the CPUC, whether it's this effort or a later phase, to talk about that, because this is where a lot of the expertise is. But that's really a preference. So I was pleased to see it noted as something we need to talk through. I'm just a little confused procedurally if you are thinking you would defer that for details, or if that is supposed to be something, a focus of this options paper. And so I'm trying to get some guidance on what to focus on, if that's too detailed for comments back to you, or if we're really trying to focus on the program structure rather than implementation details.
I think it'd be appropriate for this upcoming round of comments and would help us focus our efforts. You can, sorry if this is a bit of a cagey answer, but we consider getting this program stood up and having the procurement that's going to flow from it being a very top priority time-wise to help the state meet its goals. And you know, if you were in our shoes trying to design a program, would you want to wait for ledge fixes on all details, or if you had the authority to, would you just move forward with them?
Understood. Thank you very much for the extra guidance.
Thank you, Kathleen. So keeping the clock in mind, my apologies to Matthew Longer and Nuo Tang. If you guys could both put your questions in the Q&A chat or the Q&A bar in the lower right, that'd be very helpful. And we'll move on to the next section.
Okay, Dina and I are going to do teamwork on this section. I think starting with you, Dina.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dina Mackin. I'm the supervisor for the retail choice section, overseeing policies related to PCIA and provider of last resort. And I've been working with the IRP team on considerations of all the of market factors that will need to be considered when designing this procurement program. And so the first one that we want to talk about is how to address meeting reliability targets in the event of an LSC market exit. The PUC has adopted and implemented a process for returning customers to the IOU in the event of CCA failure. Currently we have designated the IOU as a provider of last resort. The PUC is open proceeding to consider new rules to ensure the state reliability and GHG mission targets are maintained and on track, and that the Polar can recover its costs to avoid cost shifting of costs onto the bundled customers. Most of the issues related to LSC's market exit will be considered and addressed within the scope of the Polar proceeding. Some bankruptcy-related issues, however, are going to need to be considered within the scope of IRP and this program design. For instance, one of the main ones is how the Polar will meet its reliability and GHG reduction targets for load for returning customers that it might assume, and how will these associated costs be recovered. Another consideration for this procurement program is going to be whether how the PUC can meet the risk and mitigate the risk of stranded costs being shifted onto bundled customers in the event of an LSC exit. So we'll be taking comments on these questions.
Thanks, Dina. And then another externality the paper explores on the next slide that is other than to do with reliability or environment is the risk of market power. And so the paper is basically setting out to explore to what extent this externality exists, inviting comment on this, because the existence of this externality could help prioritize what features of the program are important. And so just defining market power, firstly, is what the first bullet here is doing. Basically, a participant is able to unilaterally impact the market price of a product by their actions. And specifically in our context of retail and energy market, the paper proposes that there could be market power risk of generators over LSEs, or large LSEs over smaller LSEs, or perhaps, yeah, whether large or small, but there could be market power risk between LSEs. So we've already touched on one potential way of mitigating generator market power. So I won't repeat that there, but that's what the SFPFC approach is, a big rationale behind it. And then another approach we haven't talked about is the use of centralized auctions. So the involvement of a clearinghouse and the pooling of counterparty risk would enable to have all LLCs, regardless of their size, to have similar access to contracts. That is a feature that's mentioned in the SFPFC approach, and a bit more on that later in the straw option section. Passing back to Dina.
Great. So the next issue for consideration is how past and centralized procurement are accounted for when establishing the reliability requirements. When one LSC procures on behalf of the customers of other LSCs, due to load departure and centralized procurement, the CPUC seeks to follow the cost causation principle, where costs are borne by and the benefits are credited to the customers on behalf of whom they were procured. Under the cost allocation mechanism, the attributes and costs are centrally procured and count towards the LSC's RA obligations. LSCs might similarly be able to claim the capacity in renewables or GHG attributes of resources subject to CAM in the new procurement program. Under the PCIA, the allocation of attributes was addressed in D21 05030, where we considered the voluntary allocation and market offering mechanisms for RPS, GHG free energy, and RA attributes of IOU legacy procurement that is subject to the PCIA. For the RPS attributes, the decision approved and established a process for VAMO for current RPS compliance periods, which is going to be reevaluated in advance of future compliance periods. For the non-RPS GHG free energy attributes, the decision rejected the VAMO, citing the lack of sufficient record. However, it is currently being allocated out until 2023. And then finally, for the RA attributes, the decision is rejected the VAMO, citing specific reasons specific to the application of VAMO proposal to the RA program. So for this decision and other future decisions affecting resource attributes are going to be relevant to considering how past and centralized procurement should be treated in the, for compliance in the new procurement program.
Thanks, Dina. And then to round out this section, we're actually going to pick up what's quite an early section of the paper called additional design features. If you're following along the paper, it's section 4.2. I think just along the lines of what Lauren was laying out earlier, we wanted to basically acknowledge these design features, which will be probably necessary to address to implement a program, but to have front and center the fundamental design elements, and then but then also to due course. Okay, so just a bit about what each of these main points are here. The procurement subcategories point touched on before about new and existing. I think also just back on the earlier discussion or question about resource specific procurement and how would the need determination of the program sort of deal with the possibility of resource specific need being found in parallel. And I just wanted to say that it would absolutely complement that effort. Basically, any procurement that contributes to reliability or GHG reduction would be eligible to count towards procurement need found here. And if we do it in as attribute-based terms as possible, that'd be most economically efficient. Then the point about managing changes over time, say between T+5, the need determination for T+5, and then real time, and in the 5 years, many things could change. Maybe that could be addressed by requiring nearer term showings to have more granularity than those that are 5 years out. Or maybe that's just sort of a risk of sort of error or planning reality that just we have to live with. Then the bullet about procurement approaches like centralized or standard offer. I've talked about centralized just on an earlier slide, so it won't go there again. But then, well, except to say that it does help, arguably, for quality control and transparency about the contracts that are being procured. And that's something that a standard office process could do too. So I think of the existing renewable auction mechanism around contracts. And perhaps this matter is not a case of either or, but maybe there's some role for alternatives to the status quo, which is bilateral procurement processes. And then, given California's retail market structure, the program must be flexible to load migration occurring between LSEs or an LSE and exiting the market. And I think this is possibly directly picked up by the need allocation being updated annually, say, based on the latest load forecast. But definitely requires us to keep an eye on that possible additional design feature. And then finally, as a broad one here, is just how to allow for the risk of errors or inaccuracies across all steps of the program. But with that, we'll now switch to the section on the straw design options, which is our final main topic for the day. I think we've caught up on a bit of time, but still running a little behind. All right, so this is section 8 of the paper, and the purpose of these straw options is to really just help illustrate the meaning of the design concept that we've already discussed and that the paper goes into more detail. We want to emphasize that while we've grouped particular reliability and GHG reduction elements and features into 4 options, that's really to convey that the new program should be designed for both of those things, reliability and GHG reduction. And actually, in our thinking so far, we don't think that the choice of a reliability design necessitates a particular GHG reduction design and vice versa. So in other words, in your comments and looking at these options, please think about mix and matching between the options we've laid out there, and we expect there'll be options that are not even mentioned that could be just as or more likely to meet the program's objectives. And before stepping into the options on the next slide, there's a concept that's common across all options. And what we're trying to depict here is that in aid of this being a predictable, transparent, ongoing process, we sort of really want to draw attention to the linkage, or the potential linkages the program could have between the planning track, with the planning track. So if you're looking at this cycle, thinking of in a clockwise direction, starting from the planning track, as James was explaining, and I was trying to earlier too, the GHG reduction need found to be necessary in the planning track, and then the reliability need, and also the resource counting, like the LCCs or their equivalents found in the planning track, would be inputs to the program and update the program over time. And then it would be important that the program, like procurement progress as part of the program, then feeds back into the planning track, so the planning track remains current in terms of its baseline assumptions and perhaps other important inputs and assumptions. And then if we advance the slide, just introduce the role of procurement orders as distinct from program. These still may be needed, particularly in the case of resource-specific needs being found, as mentioned a couple of times now. So they would, if you look at the bottom part of the slide being procurement track, it consists of a program plus possible procurement orders, also feeding into the cycle. Okay, so now into the store options. A few other features are common to all of them. They're not, well, there's, a detailed table that James and I are going to try to summarize here in a couple of slides. So things you don't see on these slides, but are important across all 4 options are that all LLCs are self-providing, must self-provide. The scope of the need addressed by the program under all these options is existing plus new resources. And there's this common idea of a rolling forward requirement 10 years ahead. But again, illustrative and seeking feedback on that broad idea. So first I'll discuss the reliability side here and then hand to James on the GHG. So options 1 and 2, these first 2 columns, they're most similar to the concepts in the IRP planning track. Option 1 and 2 differ in the resource counting used for compliance. So option 1 uses marginal LCCs, 2 uses average. So then, as I was trying to get at earlier, that then has implications for need determination and need allocation. So under option 1, we would be setting system marginal reliability need to meet the 0.1 reliability standard. And then need would be allocated to each LSE based on their net peak forecast plus a PRM. Option 2, need would be determined as a system's total reliability need to meet 0.1 and then allocated to each LSE according to their managed peak plus PRM. Okay, and then option 3, slice of day. So generally, you'll see this described in section 8 here in the form of basically a high-level statement of what the RA program is moving to per the RA decision earlier this year. Yeah, and it's high level, and I think it's an open question, and comments would really help inform whether the concepts can be extended from that RA near-term context to mid to long-term contracting. The 4th column here, option 4, is this standardized fixed price forward energy contracting approach. In other words, mandatory energy hedging, but with some specific features. And generally, we've written this option here in line with how the earlier parts of the paper discuss it. But one exception is that we pose that bilateral rather than centralized processes would be more feasible to implement. Yet it's not a sort of fundamental, like that wouldn't completely undermine the rationale of that option, of that approach. And then finally, just comparing these options across the rows, if you just focus on enforcement, we've got backstop and penalties common for all. Option 4 has a twist on this, whereby the suppliers are the ones directly subject to the cost of backstop. So they would also be, so they're also subject to the risk of forward showings not being adequate, as I was explaining earlier, and having to sell down their contracts at a discount. And both of these things would be in addition to their inherent incentive to show up in the hours that they're needed, or face, wholesale market determined difference payments. I'm going to hand to James and look forward to our final round of questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Neil. Yeah, so here we show the GHG related options. There were 2 options that were proposed for GHG reduction, the clean energy standard and the mass-based. So although there are 4 columns here, we're really proposing 2 different ones, and they're just sort of paired with different reliability options from the previous slide. But I want to emphasize that there's no magic really to these options being paired with certain reliability options. So, although in the staff options paper, you can read them vertically as, option 1 being this particular reliability option and this particular GHG option, we see them as pretty interchangeable, and that you could really mix and match any of these and still have a cohesive program. So just want to caution anybody who's wondering, there's no reason any one of these in particular has to be paired with any particular reliability option. So the clean energy standard, I mean, I'll just sort of quickly run through what, the proposal, or not even really a proposal, just the straw option being laid out here is, but it's a repeat of what I already said in the previous slide. So at the need determination stage, clean energy standard is setting a CES target based on the modeled amount of clean energy projected to be needed on the system to meet the electric sector GHG target as defined in the planning track. Need allocation would be the same as it is for need determination. They're both, it's a percentage share of annual energy sold by the LSE, and the target for need allocation would be the same as the target in need determination. For compliance, the forward showing straw option is a 50% 5-year ahead clean energy need needing to be under contract. That declines annually thereafter. And the forward showing, and that's less than 100% because we want to leave more room for the use of credits and to be able to benefit from the fungibility and tradability of that as a compliance option. So in the backwards aspects of this compliance option, 100% of the requirement is met through REC and or zero emission credit retirement at the end of a 3 to 4 year compliance period. For all these GHG options, we're not proposing a backstop mechanism. So that's a distinction from the reliability straw options. As I was mentioning before, we're just, the straw option here is a penalty for noncompliance based on a $1 per megawatt hour basis. And a note, I guess, just on how resource counting would work under this option is that every unit of contracted renewable energy or non-RPS clean energy would be demonstrated through a REC or zero emission credit. That's true for whether it's a backwards showing retiring the credit or forward showing contracting for the energy, which is inclusive of the credit. And LLCs would be reporting their forward contracted and these amounts in regular showings. Mass-based, it's basically everything I was just talking about before. Set the target based on the planning tracks target, assign the annual target to LSEs based on their load share and the share of emissions within each service territory. The straw option proposed here is a 100% forward contracting requirement 5 years out, which is higher than the 50% being proposed for clean energy standard. But if folks think that that should be different, then please let us know. And as I was mentioning before, there's different flavors of backwards showing, but at the end of the day, the LSE needs to show that they brought online the resources or kept online the resources that they contracted for in their forward showings. And the penalties are a $1 per ton basis for GHG emissions in excess of their GHG target. And then for mass-based, for option 3, if you remember, reliability was slice of day. The reason we set option 2 here is because loosely you could see some efficiency in having a mass-based clean system, like the hourly granularity of a clean system power calculator could pair well with the sort of hourly slice of day type requirement there. So you could potentially have like the same calculator showing compliance for both requirements. So that's why we said same as option 2 for the third option. But again, there's no magic to that, and you could pair clean energy standard with a slice of day requirement as well. And then for this fourth option here on reliability, that was the SFPFC. Either approach works, but we just said same as option one here because we had to pick something. Next slide. So we've been kind of alluding to this throughout the presentation, that an important part of program design and eventual implementation is going to be figuring out how to streamline these filings across the planning and procurement tracks to increase the efficiency and reduce the administrative burden on both LSEs and commission staff. Where possible, we want to avoid duplicative filings, and part of the goal here is to increase the predictability of when procurement actions and filings are going to be required. So under the current approach, represented here at the top half of the screen as basically the previous IRP cycle, LSEs have their regular IRP plan filings in the planning track, which is the top yellow bubble. But then there were also two standalone procurement orders, D1911-016, the midterm reliability order, which happen out of sync with the filings of the planning track, and so each one had their own separate sets of compliance filings, and so those are represented as the two yellow bubbles below. So that's the way it currently works, and planning and procurement are not, they're staggered in some ways for LSEs. A potential future approach depicted below is where LSE procurement requirements are set in advance and embedded into the program. And so all planning and procurement track compliance filings can be combined potentially into a single set of filings due at the same time. So under this approach, the LSE could show all of their online and contracted under development resources to demonstrate program compliance, while also showing their planned resources to meet their planning requirements that further out into the future. And those plans could still be incorporated into preferred system plan development. Of course, as mentioned before, there may still be a need for one-off procurement orders in the future, maybe for long lead time resources or other type of centralized type of procurement needs. So even with a procurement program in place. So if that occurs, there may still be a need for separate filings, but that's how we sort of envision streamlining this within IRP. The paper does also note that there could be other opportunities for streamlining program filings with RPS or other periodic LSE filings, which, the extent to which we could do that, I think would be, being able to do that would be more or less feasible depending on which program design option is ultimately picked. But we definitely welcome, we'll be thinking about it, and we welcome any stakeholder input on ideas for streamlining filings within the IRP and also across CPUC programs. And I think I can pass it back now to Nathan to go over next steps.
Let's actually pause for a second and see if there's any Q&A we need to deal with. I saw one or two people popping in and out of the Q&A with hands up. I see Hillary Aber. Let's unmute you. Go ahead, Hillary.
Great, this is Hillary Aber representing Large Scale Solar. I just wanted to, I've heard you say a couple times that there's no backstop procurement or I guess backstop compliance associated with the GHG targets, but there is for reliability. I'm just wondering if you could expand on why that is.
Well, first of all, we're still in the options paper phase. So if anyone thinks that there should be a backstop element of the GHG, then suggest it and put it in your comments. I think the thinking on staff's part was with reliability, if that procurement does not happen, you are potentially in a energy shortage situation, and that procurement has to happen. You can't catch up later on a reliability shortfall that happened the year before, whereas on GHGs, you are able to maybe catch up a little bit more. And so maybe just a stiff financial penalty or other sort of non-financial penalties are enough to spur compliance there.
Yeah, I'd just add designing for backstop complicates things. So let's keep it for when we absolutely need it. But I think James said that well.
Let's move to Brent Buffington from Edison.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So Brent Buffington, Southern California Edison. So I know the summary of options on slide 36 is a summary, but I think we'd all benefit from a little bit more precise language around the options. So options, I think all of these, we're talking about annual effective capacity needed to get to 0.1 LOLE, or share of annual net peak, share of annual managed peak, share of, I think for a slice a day, share of the 24 hours of the highest load day of the year. And anyway, so just as the rest of us formulate our comments, if this could be republished, that'd be really helpful with a little bit more specificity on what these things are. And I know there's some text in the paper itself, but I find this one lacking, and like almost need this comparison without a lot of specification of what this is.
Yeah, we're talking about annual here, and I think the slice a day point kind of gets it though. Could the granularity of the RA program's version of slice a day be appropriate? So I don't think we're clear on that one, but the rest is annual, sort of building out the IRP planning and track approach to things. On the idea of issuing a new paper, I hadn't planned for it, and I would say just basically take these options in the spirit of being straw and like run with your interpretations that build into a better approach. But I mean,
got it. Yeah, and just explain what our thinking is. I appreciate that, Neil.
I'll also add, you mentioned that there's some longer text, but I'll just elaborate on that for everybody's benefit, that this table and the one on the next slide are simplified representations of a much longer table in the staff options paper that follows these two, where each of the ideas here is spelled out in more detail. So you can always look up each of these stages for each of these options in the longer table to get more detail. And everything comes from we don't introduce new concepts here. So if you're confused about what something means, you can also look at how it's described earlier in the paper. That's probably what we're driving at, if you're not able to get it from that table.
I appreciate it.
So not seeing any more hands raised, I think we can move to the last slide, try to wrap things up with some next steps. So the ruling from the 8th that released the paper posed questions to stakeholders, and we have a bunch of them listed here. I'm not going to go row by row. I'll just quickly try to summarize. Questions 1 and 2 that we want you guys looking at are looking for feedback on how we frame the problem. Did we actually articulate the right building blocks? Did we articulate them well? Are there other building blocks that you think should be in there? Please let us know. On questions 4 and 5, we're looking for broad feedback on the range of options discussed in these sections. So I guess that kind of gets to my previous point about numbers 1 and 2, which is, it's a little bit different than assessing the options, which it kind of comes later. For number 6, we'd want you thinking about, how would you help prioritize need for the various design features? Like, does one take priority over another? For 7 and 8, please help us assess the options in the paper and recommend one or perhaps a mix of some that combine different elements of what we discussed. or maybe you have a design in mind that we didn't even touch on, but you think would be effective. So we'd look forward to hearing about that. For 10, 11, and 12, we'd be thinking more about topics not really discussed in the paper today, and so we're looking how to build those into the programmatic approach too. The ruling also asked for comment on the potential need for interim solutions. So I think that's questions 13 through 15. In the instance that what we've discussed here can't be implemented in a program in a reasonable amount of time. But in a general sense, we've been working quite a while as staff to try to get this thinking in front of you and paint this picture for the stakeholder community so you can understand, where we think we are in the process and what we think the universe of things is that we should consider going forward, knowing that we have to get better at procurement. This is the juncture where we pass the baton over to you, stakeholders, to take the content of this paper, to take what we discussed here today, to take the chat transcript from today that we will post, and help us get to the next stage of the conversation. A reminder that comments are due on November 7th, replies are due on November 28th. We really look forward to seeing those. We really look forward to continuing the collaboration with all of you and advancing this and advancing other IRP priorities and our goals on all fronts. If for whatever reason you desire more interaction on this and say a smaller group environment, please do reach out. I imagine that some folks will have burning questions that aren't quite answered yet, or ones that'll just pop into your head later that maybe would benefit from conversation. But for now, I think we can do one last call for questions. Hillary, I still see a hand up. I'm assuming that that's up from before. And there's still maybe an unanswered question from the Q&A that we will try to get to in text and have it posted to the website, considering that we are now at time. Neil, James, anything else you wanted to add before we adjourn?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks. Look, only a few of us have presented today, but the work to develop the papers come about through a number of discussions and reviews with colleagues across all the subject matter areas that we've talked about today. So thanks a lot. And yeah, we really thank you all for your questions and looking forward to working through the next phase of this with all your thinking.
Yeah, ditto. Same thing. Thank you to parties, and thank you to colleagues, especially on the retail choice, RPS, and RA teams that really help make this paper stronger.
Yes, and apologies also for a particularly difficult week in IRP, where we'll be seeing most of you again within 48 hours, Thursday morning, to discuss potential updates to our inputs and assumptions process. Otherwise, thank you very much. See you then, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.